So, the world seems pretty divided right now, right? You've got Team West, led by the US and Europe, squarely behind Ukraine. And then you have Russia. But here's where it gets interesting and honestly, a little complicated. When the UN held a vote to condemn Russia's invasion, you might have expected the whole world to jump on board. But a huge chunk of Africa didn't. In fact, many African nations either abstained from the vote or sided with Russia. And everyone in the West was like, wait, what? Don't they see what's happening? It's a question that makes you scratch your head, especially if you're only watching Western news. The thing is, this isn't a simple case of good guys versus bad guys for many on the African continent. The reasons are layered, like a really complex multi-generational lasagna of history. We're talking about decades of political alliances, economic dependencies, strategic maneuvering, and a deep, deep memory of who showed up for them when it mattered. It's not just about what's happening in Ukraine today. It's about what happened in Angola in the 70s, what happened in Libya in 2011, and what's happening with grain shipments and security contracts right now. So, if you really want to understand why so many African countries are looking at this conflict and saying, you know what, we're going to sit this one out, or even quietly nodding towards Moscow, you have to zoom out. You have to look past the headlines and dig into a story that connects the Cold War to today's global power plays. It's a story of loyalty, skepticism, and a continent determined to forge its own path, even if that path looks confusing from the outside. Let's get into it. To understand Africa's position today, you have to rewind the clock, way back. Back to a time when many African nations were just drawings on a European map, fighting tooth and nail for their freedom. During the mid-20th century, as independence movements swept across the continent, these new nations looked around for allies. And who did they see? The West? Well, not so much. Many Western powers were the very colonial empires they were fighting against, like trying to get a reference from the boss you're suing for wrongful termination. It was awkward, so they looked elsewhere. And that's when the Soviet Union stepped onto the scene. Moscow rolled out the red carpet, both literally and figuratively. They saw a golden opportunity. By supporting these burgeoning African nations, they could not only stick it to their Cold War rivals, but also spread their communist ideology. The USSR provided money, weapons, military training, and crucially, diplomatic support at the UN. They framed themselves as the champions of the oppressed, the ultimate anti-imperialist force. For leaders like Angola's Agostinho Neto or Mozambique's Samora Machel, this wasn't just theory, it was the tangible support that helped them win their liberation wars. This created a powerful, lasting legacy. Think about it. If someone helps you get your house back from a bully who's been living in it for 100 years, you don't forget that. Even if that helper's grandson gets into some trouble down the line, you're going to remember the original favor. Today's Russia, as the successor state to the Soviet Union, inherits that goodwill. For many older politicians and military leaders in Africa, the memory of Soviet solidarity is still very much alive. It's a debt of gratitude that has been passed down through generations, shaping a worldview where Russia isn't the aggressor, it's the old friend who had their back when no one else would. Now let's talk about the other side of the coin, the West. While Russia inherits a legacy of friendship, the West inherits, well, a lot of baggage. For many African nations, listening to Western countries talk about upholding international law and respecting sovereignty feels a little bit rich. It's like getting a lecture on healthy eating from a guy who, just polished off a family-sized bucket of fried chicken. The skepticism is real, and it's earned. The history of Western intervention in Africa is long and often painful, filled with colonial exploitation, CIA-backed coups during the Cold War, and economic policies from the IMF and World Bank that many felt did more harm than good. This isn't just ancient history either. More recent events have reinforced this deep-seated distrust. Take the 2011 NATO intervention in Libya. The mission was initially sold as a limited humanitarian operation to protect civilians. But it quickly morphed into a full-blown regime change effort that toppled Muammar Gaddafi, plunging the country into a decade of chaos and civil war that destabilized the entire Sahel region. African leaders watched this unfold in horror. They had proposed their own diplomatic solution, a roadmap to peace, which was completely ignored by Western powers. The message they received was clear. Our opinions, our solutions for our own continent, don't matter. So when those same Western nations come knocking today, demanding solidarity against Russia, the response in many African capitals is a polite but firm, thanks but no thanks. There's a powerful feeling of hypocrisy. They see a West that selectively applies its principles, condemning invasions when it's politically convenient but looking the other way, or actively participating when it's not. This perceived double standard makes it very difficult for African leaders to align themselves with the West's moral crusade. It's not that they approve of what's happening in Ukraine. It's that they are deeply skeptical of the messengers and their motives. Into this void of Western trust steps modern Russia, with a very slick, very calculated diplomatic strategy. Russia isn't coming to Africa with lectures about democracy or human rights. They're not wagging their finger. Instead, they're showing up with deals, handshakes, and a message of mutual respect. Led by their veteran foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, who seems to be on a permanent tour of the continent, Russia is positioning itself as a pragmatic partner that treats African nations as equals. They're saying, "We're not here to tell you how to run your country. We're here to do business. What do you need?" This charm offensive is backed by concrete actions. The centerpiece of this strategy has been the Russia-Africa Summit, a grand event designed to showcase Russia's commitment to the continent. They roll out the red carpet, sign a flurry of memorandums, and talk about a multipolar world where power isn't just concentrated in Washington or Brussels. This language is music to the ears of African leaders who are tired of feeling like junior partners in international relations. Russia offers a partnership without the strings that often come with Western aid. No lectures on governance, no preconditions on LGBTQ+ rights, just straightforward transactions. And a huge part of that business is security. Russia has become a go-to security partner, especially for fragile states battling insurgencies. Through official military agreements and the more shadowy operations of private military contractors like the Wagner Group, Russia offers something the West is often reluctant to provide: boots on the ground and unconditional military support. For a government fighting for its survival, like in Mali or the Central African Republic, an offer of trained fighters and weapons with no human rights questions asked is incredibly appealing. It's a transactional relationship that cuts through the noise and delivers what those leaders want most: power and stability. Let's talk about the practical stuff, because at the end of the day, foreign policy is often about what you can get. And Russia has a lot to offer Africa. First and foremost, weapons. Russia is, by a huge margin, the biggest arms supplier to the African continent. We're talking fighter jets, helicopters, tanks, and guns. For countries dealing with jihadist insurgencies, civil wars, or just wanting to modernize their military, Moscow is the #1 shopping destination. These aren't just one-off sales. They are long-term relationships that come with training, maintenance, and political influence. When your entire air force is made of Russian MiGs, you're probably going to think twice before voting against Moscow at the UN. But it's not just about guns. It's also about grain. Russia, along with Ukraine, is a breadbasket to the world, and many African nations are heavily dependent on their wheat and fertilizer exports. When the war started and global food prices skyrocketed, it sent panic waves across the continent. Russia skillfully exploited this. They blamed Western sanctions for the food crisis, even though food and fertilizer were exempt, and then positioned themselves as the benevolent saviors, promising to ensure grain shipments to their African friends. Vladimir Putin literally stood at the Russia-Africa Summit and promised free grain to several countries, a PR move that was incredibly effective, painting Russia as the reliable provider and the West as the cause of their hunger. Beyond arms and food, Russia is also involved in key economic sectors like mining and energy. Russian companies are striking deals to extract valuable resources like gold, diamonds, and uranium, often in exchange for security guarantees. This creates a powerful symbiotic relationship. The African government gets the muscle it needs to stay in power and control its territory, and Russia gets access to strategic resources and a valuable political ally. For countries facing internal unrest and international isolation, this is a very attractive package deal. It's a pragmatic choice based on survival and tangible benefits, not abstract ideals. There's another huge piece of this puzzle, and it's a philosophy that runs deep in Africa's diplomatic DNA: non-alignment. This isn't a new idea. It was born during the Cold War at the Bandung Conference in 1955, where leaders from Africa and Asia got together and basically said, "A plague on both your houses." They refused to be dragged into the ideological cage match between the United States and the Soviet Union. They wanted the freedom to chart their own course, to be friends with all, enemies of none. This spirit of strategic autonomy is very much alive today. In today's world, this philosophy looks like pragmatism on steroids. Why pick a side in the Russia-Ukraine conflict when you can benefit from both? African leaders are masters at this balancing act. They can welcome the Chinese for infrastructure projects, court the Americans for development aid and trade deals under programs like AGOA, and then turn to the Russians for security assistance and wheat. It's about diversifying your partnerships to maximize your own country's interests. Choosing a side would mean closing a door, and in a world of uncertainty, nobody wants to close a door that might lead to something useful. This approach is often mistaken in the West for being pro-Russia, but for many African nations, it's simply pro-themselves. It's a calculated strategy to maintain flexibility and sovereignty. They see the world becoming multipolar again, with multiple centers of power, and they intend to leverage that to their advantage. By refusing to be drawn into what they see as a European conflict, they preserve their ability to engage with all global powers on their own terms. It's a rejection of the idea that they must be pawns in someone else's great game. Instead, they are positioning themselves to be players in their own right. In the 21st century, wars aren't just fought with tanks and drones. They're fought with tweets, TV broadcasts, and WhatsApp messages. And in Africa, Russia is playing the information game very, very well. State-backed media outlets like RT and Sputnik have been aggressively expanding their presence across the continent, broadcasting in French, English, and Arabic. They offer a slickly produced alternative narrative that directly challenges Western viewpoints. Their message is consistent. Russia is a force for stability. The West is a neo-colonial hypocrite, and the war in Ukraine was provoked by NATO expansion. This narrative finds fertile ground, especially among younger Africans who are already skeptical of Western media sources. Russian outlets tap into genuine grievances about colonialism and Western hypocrisy, framing current events through that historical lens. They amplify voices that are critical of the US and Europe, creating an echo chamber that reinforces a pro-Russian or at least anti-Western worldview. This is then spread rapidly through social media, with coordinated campaigns using bots and influencers to push pro-Kremlin talking points and disinformation, muddying the waters and making it difficult for people to distinguish fact from fiction. This shaping of public opinion has a real impact on politics. When a significant portion of the population believes that Russia is the good guy, or at least that the West is the bad guy, it gives political leaders cover to pursue closer ties with Moscow. It creates a domestic political environment where abstaining at the UN or signing a security deal with Russia is seen not as a betrayal of international values, but as a bold act of anti-imperialist defiance. The information war is crucial because it helps build the popular consent needed for the strategic partnership to flourish, turning geopolitical alignment into a grassroots sentiment. So, when we ask why so many African nations lean towards Russia, the answer isn't a simple one-liner. It's not necessarily a full-throated endorsement of the invasion of Ukraine. Instead, it's a complex calculation, a decision woven from many different threads. There's the powerful thread of history, a genuine gratitude for Soviet support during the liberation struggles, a debt that hasn't been forgotten. This creates a foundation of loyalty that Western nations, with their own colonial histories, simply cannot match. It's a deep-seated bond that influences decisions to this day. Then you have the profound skepticism of the West. Decades of perceived hypocrisy, from colonial abuses to the chaotic intervention in Libya, have left a bitter taste. When the West calls for a united front based on shared values, many in Africa can't help but roll their eyes, remembering all the times those values seem to be optional. This distrust pushes them towards partners who, like Russia, don't come with moral lectures. It's a pragmatic pivot away from partners they feel they can't fully trust, and toward those offering a more straightforward, transactional relationship. Ultimately, this stance is a declaration of independence in foreign policy. It's a blend of strategic interest, needing Russia's guns and grain, and the long-held principle of non-alignment. African nations are asserting their right to choose their own friends and make their own decisions based on what's best for them, not what's best for Washington, London, or Brussels. They are navigating a complex new world, and their neutrality or support for Russia is a sign that the continent is no longer a passive stage for global dramas, but an active, strategic player with its own script.